Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Now, let's begin. Charlotte was supposed to be a quick in-and-out job. 3 days of meetings with a manufacturing client, then back home to Philadelphia. April of 2023 had been brutal on my schedule, with corporate sending me to a different city almost every week for these consulting gigs. Most guys who graduated with me in 2012 were already deep into family life, coaching Little League and complaining about lawn care, while I was still memorizing hotel checkout times and living off expense reports. The Airbnb I found was suspiciously cheap for downtown, $62 a night when everything else hovered around $200. But my company capped reimbursements, and I had become an expert at finding deals that let me pocket the difference. The listing photo showed a modest third-floor apartment in an old brick building. Nothing special, but functional. I pulled up around 9 that Wednesday night after fighting traffic from the airport, and the street was oddly quiet. Just a handful of parked cars and the dim glow of shops closing down. I grabbed my suitcase from the trunk, punched in the lockbox code, and climbed the narrow stairwell to Unit 3B without passing a single soul. The apartment smelled faintly of lemon cleaning spray, that artificial freshness hosts use to mask the reality of strangers cycling through every few days. Everything looked close enough to the photos, though clearly more worn. The hardwood floors had deep scratches near the doorways, the couch cushions held permanent impressions from countless bodies, and the kitchen appliances had that yellowed plastic look of things too old to be stylish but too functional to replace. Still, the bed was made with crisp white sheets, the bathroom had fresh towels, and the Wi-Fi connected on the first try. Good enough for my purposes. What drew my attention was the small balcony off the living room, just wide enough for 2 cheap plastic chairs and a neglected plant that had died months ago. I stepped outside to get some air after unpacking, and that is when I noticed the view. Directly across the street, maybe 40 feet away, sat an upscale jewelry store with tasteful window displays and security lights that cast a warm glow on cases full of watches and diamonds. Pretty spot for a cigarette if I still smoked, I thought. I stood there for a few minutes scrolling through work emails, admiring how the gems caught the light, then went inside and passed out from exhaustion without giving it another thought. Thursday came and went in a blur of conference rooms and handshakes. The client was demanding but reasonable, and by 6 in the evening I had wrapped up most of the critical discussions. I stopped at a Thai place a few blocks from the apartment, ate alone at the bar while watching a basketball game I did not care about, and made it back to the Airbnb around 8:30. The building was quiet again, and I passed an elderly woman on the second-floor landing who nodded politely but said nothing. Once inside, I kicked off my shoes, loosened my tie, and decided to enjoy the balcony for a bit before diving into the report I needed to finish. The evening air was cool and pleasant, that perfect spring temperature where you do not need a jacket but appreciate long sleeves. I leaned against the railing, looking down at the street, watching a couple walk by holding hands, when something caught my eye. A small black shape tucked underneath the metal railing, almost invisible, unless you were standing at that exact angle. At first I thought it was a piece of electrical tape or some weatherproofing material, but when I crouched down to look closer, my throat tightened. It was a camera, compact and deliberately concealed, its tiny lens pointed directly at the jewelry store across the street. I stayed crouched there for what felt like a full minute, just staring at this thing that should not exist. The camera was professional looking, matte black housing with no visible brand markings, mounted with industrial adhesive and angled with precision. This was not some random security measure a paranoid landlord might install. It was pointed outward, not at the apartment entrance or the balcony itself. Someone had placed it there specifically to watch that jewelry store, and they had done it carefully enough that a casual guest would never notice. I stood up slowly, my mind racing through possibilities. Maybe the Airbnb host was some kind of private investigator? Maybe the police had set up surveillance and forgotten to remove it? Neither explanation made sense, but I desperately wanted one of them to be true. I pulled out my phone and took a few pictures of the camera from different angles, some instinct telling me I might need documentation later. Then I stepped back inside the apartment and locked the balcony door, suddenly very aware of how exposed those large windows made me feel. The jewelry store gleamed across the street, beautiful and oblivious, and I wondered what exactly I had stumbled into. I tried to convince myself I was overreacting. Maybe the previous tenant was a photography enthusiast who liked capturing street scenes. Maybe it was an old security setup the host forgot to mention. I paced around the living room for a few minutes, then decided I needed a glass of water to calm my nerves. The kitchen was small and cramped, just a narrow galley with barely enough counter space to prepare a sandwich. I opened the cabinet above the sink looking for a clean glass, found one, filled it from the tap. My hands were not steady. As I turned to set the glass down, I noticed one of the drawers beneath the counter was slightly ajar, maybe half an inch open. Normally, I would have ignored it, but something about the night had put me on edge, made me hyper-aware of every detail. I pulled the drawer open, expecting to find the usual junk. Takeout menus, a can opener, maybe some dead batteries. Instead, I found a folded city map, the kind you pick up for free at gas stations, worn at the creases like it had been opened and closed dozens of times. Beneath it sat a small spiral notebook with a black cover, the type students use for class notes. I should have closed that drawer and walked away. I should have minded my own business and gone to bed. But my fingers were already reaching for the map before my brain could stop them. The map unfolded to show downtown Charlotte, and my stomach turned to ice when I saw what someone had done to it. The jewelry store across the street was circled in red ink, not once, but at least 7 or 8 times, the circles layered on top of each other with obsessive intensity. Small X marks dotted the surrounding blocks, each one labeled with cryptic abbreviations I could not decipher. An arrow pointed to an alley behind the store with the words "Service Entrance," written in neat, careful handwriting. I set the map aside and opened the notebook with fingers that had gone numb. The first few pages contained what looked like a schedule, names I did not recognize paired with times and days of the week. Carla, opens Mon Wed Fry, arrives 8:45, disarms 8:52. Another entry read, "Night security passes at 11:13, clockwork never varies." Page after page of detailed observations about the jewelry store's operations, employee habits, delivery schedules, alarm company response times. This was not a curious neighbor keeping casual notes. This was reconnaissance, methodical and thorough, the kind of preparation that comes before something very bad happens. I closed the notebook and stood frozen in that tiny kitchen, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, trying to process the fact that I was standing in what appeared to be a staging ground for a robbery. My first instinct was to call the police, but something held me back. What would I even say? I found a camera and some notes in an Airbnb, and I think someone might be planning a crime? They would ask questions I could not answer, maybe even suspect I was involved somehow. I was a stranger in this city, staying in a cheap rental across from a jewelry store, and I had just admitted to snooping through drawers. The optics were terrible. I decided to pack my things quietly, leave the apartment, find a hotel for the night, and figure out what to do in the morning with a clear head. I was halfway to the bedroom to grab my suitcase when I heard it. Footsteps in the stairwell, slow and deliberate, the heavy tread of boots on old wooden steps. The building had been silent all evening, and these footsteps were not the casual pace of someone coming home after a long day. They were measured, purposeful, and they stopped on the 3rd floor landing. I stood perfectly still in the middle of the living room, holding my breath, listening. Voices now, low and muffled, at least 2 different people speaking in hushed tones right outside my door. I could not make out the words, but the rhythm was unmistakable. This was a conversation, not a greeting between neighbors passing in the hall. I moved toward the door as quietly as I could manage, stepping on the edges of the floorboards where they were less likely to creak. The apartment had one of those old doors with a brass peephole, cloudy with age but still functional. I pressed my eye against it and felt my entire body go rigid. 3 men stood in the narrow hallway, clustered close together like they were trying not to be overheard. The one closest to my door was tall and broad-shouldered, wearing a dark jacket and watching the stairwell like he expected someone else to appear. The second man was shorter, wiry, with a shaved head that gleamed under the dim hallway light. The third stood slightly apart from the others, older than them by at least a decade, with gray at his temples and the calm, patient expression of someone who had done this kind of thing before. The tall one leaned in close to the older man and said something I could not hear. The older man shook his head slowly, then replied in a voice just loud enough to reach me through the thin door. "Check if the renter saw the setup. If he touched the materials, we handle it tonight." The shaved-head man reached for my doorknob, and I watched in horror as it began to turn. The deadbolt held. I had locked it out of habit when I came in, the way you do in unfamiliar places without even thinking. The knob twisted left, then right, then stopped. A pause. Someone muttered something about keys, and I heard the older man say, "Bobby has the spare. He is on his way up." I had seconds, maybe a minute at most. My mind went blank with panic, then snapped into survival mode with a clarity I did not know I possessed. The balcony. It was my only option. I moved fast but tried to stay silent, grabbing my phone and wallet from the kitchen counter, leaving everything else behind. The bedroom had a window that faced the same direction as the balcony, and I remembered seeing a fire escape during my brief exploration of the apartment. I slipped into the bedroom and eased the window open, wincing at the soft scrape of wood against wood. The fire escape was there, old and rusted but solid enough, dropping down to a narrow alley between buildings. Behind me, I heard new footsteps on the landing. Bobby with the spare key, I assumed, and the sound of metal sliding into a lock. I climbed out onto the fire escape and pulled the window mostly closed behind me, leaving it open just a crack so it would not latch and trap me if I needed to come back. Not that I planned to ever set foot in that apartment again. The fire escape shuddered under my weight as I descended, each step producing a metallic groan that sounded deafening in the quiet night. I forced myself to move slowly, gripping the railing with white knuckles, terrified that the noise would alert the men now entering the apartment above me. Second floor, first floor, then a ladder that dropped the final 10 feet into the alley. I hung from the bottom rung and let go, landing hard on concrete and feeling the impact shoot through my ankles. The alley was dark and narrow, lined with dumpsters and the back entrances of businesses that had closed hours ago. I could hear muffled sounds from above, footsteps moving through the apartment, a door slamming, someone shouting something I could not make out. They had discovered I was gone. I ran. Not jogged, not walked quickly, but ran with everything I had toward the strip of light at the end of the alley where it opened onto a main street. My dress shoes slapped against wet pavement, my lungs burned, and I did not look back once. I burst onto the sidewalk and nearly collided with a woman walking her dog, who gave me a startled look as I mumbled an apology and kept moving. 2 blocks later, I found a busy sports bar with a crowd of people visible through the windows, and I pushed through the door like a drowning man reaching for a life raft. I found a booth in the back corner, slid in with my back against the wall, and tried to steady my breathing while a waitress asked if I wanted anything. I ordered a beer. I had no intention of drinking, just to have a reason to stay. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unlock my phone, but I managed to pull up the photos I had taken of the camera on the balcony. Evidence. I had evidence. I called 911 and told the dispatcher everything: the hidden camera, the map with the jewelry store circled, the notebook full of schedules, the 3 men who had come to the apartment, what I heard them say through the door. The dispatcher kept me on the line while she sent units to the building, asking me to describe everything again. Slower this time. 20 minutes later, 2 officers found me at the bar and escorted me to their cruiser. They drove me back to the block where the Airbnb was located, but we did not go inside. Instead, we parked across the street and I watched from the back seat as more police arrived. Then detectives in unmarked cars, Then a van I later learned belonged to a task force that had been investigating a string of high-end jewelry heists across 3 states. The officers asked me questions for over an hour, taking notes, recording my statement, examining the photos on my phone. One of them told me I was lucky, that these guys were professionals, that people who stumbled onto operations like this usually did not get the chance to run. The investigation took months to unfold, but I only learned the details much later through news reports and a single follow-up call from a detective named Reyes. The apartment had been rented under a fake identity, paid for with prepaid cards that were nearly impossible to trace. The 3 men I saw were part of a crew responsible for at least 4 other robberies, all targeting high-end jewelry stores in mid-sized cities across the Southeast. They would rent apartments with good sightlines, spend weeks documenting patterns and security protocols, then execute precise smash-and-grab operations that lasted under 3 minutes. The night I fled, they had apparently been there to retrieve their surveillance equipment and finalize their plan. The robbery was scheduled for that weekend. My accidental discovery forced them to abandon the job and scatter. 2 of them were arrested 6 weeks later during a traffic stop in Tennessee. The 3rd disappeared and remains at large as far as I know. I never went back for my suitcase or the clothes I left behind. The Airbnb listing vanished from the site within days, and I never received a response from the host when I tried to contact them. Sometimes I think about how close I came to something irreversible, how a simple habit of locking the deadbolt bought me the 60 seconds I needed to survive. I still travel for work, still book cheap rentals in unfamiliar cities, but now I check every drawer, every corner, every angle of every room before I unpack. And I always sleep with a chair wedged under the doorknob. October 2022 had been rough on me in ways I still struggle to articulate. A layoff from the marketing firm where I had worked since graduating college in 2017, followed by the kind of breakup that leaves you staring at your ceiling at 3 in the morning, wondering where exactly everything went wrong. At 26, I found myself with a severance check, an empty apartment that still smelled like my ex-boyfriend's cologne, and an overwhelming need to be anywhere else. My friend Kelsey had been living in Portland for about 2 years, and she kept texting me that I should come visit, that a change of scenery would do me good. So I booked an Airbnb, an upstairs unit in a duplex on Birchwood Road, and decided to drive down from Seattle for a long weekend. The listing looked perfect in that carefully curated way rentals always do online. Exposed brick, a clawfoot bathtub, morning light streaming through tall windows. The reviews were mostly positive, guests praising the quiet neighborhood and the responsive host named Garrett. I packed a duffel bag and left on a Friday afternoon, hoping that a few days away might help me figure out what came next. I arrived at the duplex around 4 in the afternoon, and the place looked even better than the photos. It was an old Victorian painted sage green with white trim, sitting on a tree-lined street where the oaks were just beginning to show their autumn colors. The neighborhood had that established, peaceful quality. People walking dogs, kids riding bikes in driveways, the kind of scene that makes you feel safe without thinking about it. I grabbed my bag from the trunk of my Subaru and walked toward the side entrance that led up to my unit, following the check-in instructions Garrett had sent. That was when the front door of the downstairs unit swung open with enough force to rattle the frame. A man stepped out onto the porch, late 50s, maybe early 60s, with thinning gray hair and hollow cheeks that made his eyes look too large for his face. He wore a flannel shirt buttoned wrong, one side hanging lower than the other, and his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that stopped me cold in the middle of the walkway. Before I could say hello or offer any kind of greeting, he jabbed a trembling finger toward my face and spoke in a voice thick with accusation. "You came back to finish what you started, didn't you?" I stood there for a moment, completely caught off guard, my duffel bag hanging awkwardly from my shoulder. My first instinct was to laugh, because surely this had to be some kind of mistake or maybe even a weird joke. "I'm sorry," I managed to say, keeping my voice light and friendly. "I think you might have me confused with someone else. I just got here. I'm renting the upstairs unit for the weekend." The man's expression didn't soften. If anything, his eyes narrowed further, scanning my face like he was searching for something hidden beneath the surface. He took a step closer to the edge of his porch, close enough that I could see the patchy stubble on his jaw and the dark circles carved deep under his eyes. "That's exactly what you'd say," he muttered, more to himself than to me. "That's exactly what they told you to say." I felt my smile falter, unsure how to respond to that. After an uncomfortable silence that stretched on for what felt like a full minute, he finally turned and retreated back inside, slamming his door hard enough to make the porch railing vibrate. I stood frozen on the walkway for another few seconds, trying to process what had just happened. Then I shook it off and headed up the exterior staircase to my unit, telling myself that every neighborhood has its eccentric characters. Maybe he had dementia, or maybe he was just having a bad day. People say strange things sometimes. It doesn't always mean something sinister. The upstairs apartment was exactly as advertised. Clean, bright, with that exposed brick wall and the beautiful clawfoot tub I had seen in the photos. I dropped my bag on the bed and texted Kelsey that I had arrived safely, then spent the next hour unpacking and settling in. We made plans to grab dinner the following evening, and I poured myself a glass of wine from the bottle I had brought, and sat by the window watching the street darken as the sun went down. By 9 o'clock, I had almost convinced myself that the encounter with the downstairs neighbor was nothing more than an awkward misunderstanding, something I would laugh about later. I changed into pajamas, crawled into the surprisingly comfortable bed, and closed my eyes. That was when the pacing started. At first, I thought it was just the normal sounds of an old house settling, or maybe the neighbor moving around before bed. But as I lay there in the darkness, I realized the footsteps were deliberate, back and forth, directly beneath my bedroom. The floorboards in these old Victorians are thin, and I could track his movement with unsettling precision. He would walk from one end of what I assumed was his living room to the other, pause for a few seconds, then turn and walk back, over and over again, like a caged animal. I checked my phone. It was almost 11. I told myself he was probably just an insomniac, maybe anxious about something, and that he would settle down eventually. But then I started to hear his voice. It was muffled through the floor, impossible to make out complete sentences, but the rhythm of it was clear. He was talking to himself, or maybe to someone who wasn't there. I pressed my ear closer to the mattress, straining to listen, and caught fragments that made my chest tighten. "They sent her again, and she thinks I don't know," and something that sounded horribly like, "This time I'll be ready." I barely slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, the pacing would resume, or I would hear that low, muttering voice rising up through the floorboards like smoke. By the time pale morning light began to filter through the curtains, I had maybe gotten 2 hours of broken rest. I lay there debating what to do. Should I message Garrett, the host? Should I just leave and find a hotel? Part of me felt ridiculous for being so shaken by what was probably just a lonely, mentally unwell man who posed no real threat. I decided to give it one more chance to see how things looked in the daylight. I showered, got dressed, and made myself a cup of coffee using the little Keurig machine on the kitchen counter. Around 8 in the morning, I gathered the small bag of trash I had accumulated, the wine bottle, some packaging from snacks, and headed downstairs to find the bins Garrett had mentioned were located at the side of the house. The morning air was crisp and cool, and for a moment everything felt normal again. Birds were singing, a jogger passed by on the sidewalk, and I could smell someone cooking bacon somewhere nearby. I rounded the corner toward the trash cans, and that was when the downstairs door burst open and he came rushing out, a kitchen knife clutched in his right hand. I dropped the trash bag and stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. He stopped about 6 feet away from me, close enough that I could see the blade catching the morning sunlight, close enough that I could see how badly his hand was shaking. His eyes were wild and bloodshot, rimmed with red like he hadn't slept in days, and there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool air. "Admit it," he said, his voice cracking on the words. Admit who hired you. I know you're one of them. I know they sent you to watch me, to report back. Who is it? The government? My ex-wife? Just tell me the truth and maybe we can work something out. I held my hands up slowly, palms facing him, trying to keep my breathing steady even though my heart was slamming against my ribs so hard I thought I might pass out. I don't know what you're talking about, I said, forcing my voice to stay calm. My name is Whitney. I'm just here for the weekend. I've never seen you before in my life, I swear to God. He stared at me for a long moment, the knife trembling in his grip, and I genuinely did not know if he was about to lunge at me or collapse into tears. Then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, something in his expression shifted. His shoulders sagged, and he lowered the knife to his side, though he didn't let go of it. That's what the last one said too, he muttered, his voice hollow now, drained of its previous intensity. They always say that. They always have a story. He turned and shuffled back inside without another word, closing his door behind him with a soft click that somehow felt more disturbing than a slam. I stood there in the side yard, shaking, my legs feeling like they might give out beneath me. As soon as I could move again, I rushed back up to my unit and locked the door behind me, then pushed a chair against it for good measure. I grabbed my phone and immediately called Garrett, the host, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush as I described what had just happened. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then Garrett sighed, not with concern but with what sounded almost like mild annoyance. "Oh, that's just Howard," he said, like he was explaining away a barking dog. "He's been going through a rough patch lately. Divorce, lost his job, you know how it is. He's harmless, really. Just try to avoid him and you'll be fine." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to ask how a man waving a knife at a guest could possibly be considered harmless. But Garrett kept talking, assuring me that Howard had lived in the downstairs unit for over 3 years and had never actually hurt anyone, that he just had episodes sometimes, and that they usually passed within a day or two. He offered me a partial refund if I wanted to leave early, but said it in a tone that made it clear he thought I was overreacting. I hung up the phone feeling more alone than I had in months. Kelsey was at work and couldn't come get me until the evening, and the thought of walking back to my car, which was parked on the street right in Howard's line of sight, filled me with dread. So I stayed inside, double-checking that every window was locked, keeping the chair wedged against the door. I tried to distract myself with my phone, scrolling through social media, but I kept glancing toward the floor every time I heard a creak from below. Around noon, the pacing started again. Back and forth, that relentless rhythm that I could feel in my teeth. And then, sometime in the early afternoon, the pacing stopped, and I heard footsteps coming up the exterior staircase toward my door. I held my breath, standing in the middle of the living room, staring at the door like it might explode inward at any second. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs. There was a long pause, 10 seconds, maybe 15, and then a soft scraping sound, like paper being pushed across wood. I watched as a folded piece of notebook paper slid beneath the gap at the bottom of the door, coming to rest on the hardwood floor about 2 feet in front of me. The footsteps retreated back down the stairs, slow and deliberate, and I heard Howard's door open and close. I didn't move for at least a full minute. When I finally worked up the courage to pick up the note, my fingers felt numb and clumsy, like they belonged to someone else. The handwriting was jagged and uneven, pressed so hard into the paper that it had torn through in places. It read, "I know you're here to take me. I won't go quietly. I've prepared. Tell whoever sent you that I'm ready this time. I won't let it happen again." I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it, trying to convince myself that this was just the ramblings of a sick man and not a genuine threat. But the words "I've prepared" kept echoing in my head, and I thought about that knife in his hand and I knew I had to get out of there. I started shoving my clothes back into my duffel bag, not bothering to fold anything, just cramming it all in as fast as I could. My car keys were on the kitchen counter, and I grabbed them, clutching them so tight the metal teeth dug into my palm. I called Kelsey while I packed, and she picked up on the second ring. "I need you to stay on the phone with me," I said, my voice coming out shakier than I wanted. "I'm leaving right now and I need someone to know what's happening in case something goes wrong." She asked me what was going on, and I gave her the short version: crazy neighbor, knife, threatening note, and she told me to call the police. I told her I just wanted to get out first, that I could call them from the road, that I didn't want to wait around for them to show up while Howard was downstairs doing God knows what. I zipped up my bag, slung it over my shoulder, and moved the chair away from the door. My plan was simple: get down the stairs as fast as possible, sprint to my car, and drive away without looking back. I took a deep breath, unlocked the deadbolt, and pulled the door open. That was when I heard the downstairs door slam open with a bang that echoed through the whole building. Heavy footsteps pounded up the wooden staircase, fast and furious, shaking the entire structure with each step. I didn't think, I just reacted. I slammed my door shut and threw the deadbolt, then shoved the chair back against it with all my strength. Kelsey was screaming my name through the phone, asking what was happening, and I couldn't even answer her because the footsteps had reached the top of the stairs, and now someone was pounding on my door so hard the hinges were rattling. "I know what you're doing." Howard's voice tore through the wood, raw and ragged and completely unhinged. "You're not taking me. You hear me? I won't let you take me like you took the others." I backed away from the door until I hit the far wall, my phone pressed to my ear, and I finally managed to choke out the words, "Call 911, Kelsey. Call them right now." The pounding continued, rhythmic and relentless, and I could see the door frame starting to splinter where the deadbolt met the wood. I looked around desperately for another way out, and that was when I remembered the window, the one that opened onto a small section of roof over the back porch. I ran to it, shoved it open, and climbed out onto the slanted shingles just as I heard the door finally give way behind me. The roof was steeper than it looked, and the shingles were slick with morning dew. I half crawled, half slid toward the edge, my duffel bag still somehow hanging from my shoulder, my phone clutched in my other hand. Behind me, I could hear Howard crashing through the apartment, knocking things over, screaming about conspiracies and surveillance and people coming to take him away. I reached the edge of the roof and looked down. It was maybe a 10-foot drop to the grass below, maybe less. I didn't let myself think about it. I tossed my bag down first, then lowered myself over the edge, hung by my fingertips for a second, and let go. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting through my ankles, but I was up and running before I even registered it. I sprinted around the side of the house toward my car, fumbling with my keys, not daring to look back. I could hear Howard somewhere behind me now, his voice carrying through the morning air, still ranting about them and the network, and how he wouldn't be taken alive. I reached my Subaru, ripped the door open, threw myself inside and locked it. My hands were trembling so badly it took me 3 tries to get the key in the ignition. When the engine finally roared to life, I peeled away from the curb without even checking for traffic, and I didn't stop driving until I was 3 miles away, parked in the lot of a grocery store, sobbing so hard I could barely breathe. The police found Howard inside the upstairs unit, sitting on the floor of the living room with the knife still in his hand. He didn't resist when they arrested him. Kelsey had called 911 the moment she heard the door break down, and the officers arrived within 8 minutes, an eternity when you're running for your life, but fast enough that he didn't have time to flee. I gave my statement from the grocery store parking lot, still shaking, still crying, and a detective called me later that evening to fill in the gaps. Apparently, Howard had been in and out of psychiatric facilities for years. He suffered from severe paranoid schizophrenia, and he had stopped taking his medication about 2 months before I arrived. Garrett, the host, knew about his condition, but thought he could manage the situation because Howard had been stable for a while. The detective told me I was lucky, that Howard had made similar accusations against a previous guest 6 months earlier, a woman who had cut her stay short after he followed her to her car. No charges were filed that time because she just wanted to forget it happened. I still think about that sometimes, about how close I came to being another story that got swept under the rug. I left a detailed review on the Airbnb listing, warning other travelers, and reported Garrett to the platform. The listing was taken down a few weeks later. I never went back to Portland, and even now, 2 years later, I still check the locks twice before bed. I still flinch when I hear footsteps on stairs. Some fears, once they find you, never really let go. Booking apps make me nauseous now. Not exaggerating, I mean physically sick. Friends ask me to join them on trips, and I make up excuses because I cannot explain what happened in April 2018 without sounding paranoid or crazy. At 26, right after a messy breakup that left me hollow, I decided solo travel would fix me. A co-worker had done this whole backpacking thing through Eastern Europe and kept sending photos of cheap hostels and empty beaches. I had savings from my consulting work, the flexibility to be remote for a few weeks, and nothing keeping me home anymore. So I picked a small coastal country I had only seen mentioned in budget travel blogs. Off the tourist radar, beautiful old towns, and prices that seemed almost too good. I told myself it would be an adventure, a reset. I found this apartment listing on one of those rental platforms. Nothing fancy but cheap. Around €40 a night for a one-bedroom in a town with a name I still cannot pronounce right. The reviews were decent, maybe 15 total, all short and generic but positive enough. The host called himself Bogdan, responded fast, seemed helpful through the app messages. He sent the address and a lockbox code for the key. My flight had 2 connections, and by the time I landed, it was already dark outside. A bus took me from the airport to the town center. Then I walked maybe 20 minutes dragging my suitcase over uneven cobblestone, using my phone GPS to navigate. The building looked old, 5 or 6 stories, with a heavy wooden door that groaned when I pushed it. Inside, the stairwell reeked of cigarette smoke mixed with something damp, and the lights operated on a timer that clicked off every 30 seconds, leaving me standing blind between floors while I scrambled to find the next switch. The apartment was on the 4th floor. I got the key from the lockbox, let myself in, and immediately felt relieved. It looked exactly like the photos, maybe even a bit nicer. Clean, small kitchen, a bed that seemed comfortable enough. I dropped my bags and went to close the curtains when I noticed the window faced the interior courtyard and another building across the way. A few windows over there had lights on, people moving around inside their homes. Normal stuff. I showered, ate some crackers I had packed, and decided to head out to grab a real meal since I had seen a few restaurants still open near the bus stop. It was around 10 at night, cold but not freezing, and the streets were mostly empty. I found a place that had English on the menu, ordered some kind of meat dish using hand gestures and my translation app, and ate quickly. The waiter was polite but did not speak much English. I paid in cash, left a tip, and started walking back. That is when I first saw them. 2 men standing near the entrance of my building, right by the heavy wooden door. They were not doing anything specific, just standing there smoking, talking quietly to each other. One was tall and thin, maybe in his 40s, wearing a dark jacket. The other was shorter, stockier, with a shaved head and a tracksuit. I would not have thought twice about it except for the way they both stopped talking and turned to look at me as I approached. Not a casual glance, but a direct stare that followed me as I punched in the building code and pushed the door open. I felt their eyes on my back as I stepped inside. The door closed behind me, and I stood in the dark stairwell, heart beating faster than it should have been. I told myself I was being paranoid. Jet lag, unfamiliar place, my mind playing tricks. But something about the way they watched me, like they were expecting me, stuck with me as I climbed those 4 flights of stairs in the clicking darkness. I slept badly that night, kept waking up to sounds I could not identify. Pipes groaning, doors closing somewhere in the building, muffled voices that could have been from neighboring apartments or from the stairwell. I could not tell. Around 3 in the morning, I heard footsteps outside my door. Slow, deliberate steps that stopped right in front of my apartment. I lay completely still in bed, barely breathing, staring at the thin strip of light under the door. A shadow moved across it. Someone was standing there. I waited for a knock, for something. But after maybe a minute, the footsteps continued down the hall and faded. I did not sleep again after that. I just lay there watching the ceiling turn gray as the sun came up, convincing myself it was probably just a neighbor coming home late, nothing more. In the morning, around 8, I finally got up and checked my phone. There was a message from Bogdan on the rental app, sent at 6 in the morning. It said in broken English, "You came home very late. Who brought you?" I read it 3 times trying to understand what he meant. How did he know what time I came back? The apartment had no cameras that I could see. I had checked when I arrived. And what did he mean? Who brought me? I came back alone. I typed a reply asking what he meant, trying to keep it casual, saying I just went out for dinner and came back around 10:30. He read the message immediately but did not respond. I sat on the edge of the bed holding my phone, and that uneasy feeling from the night before came flooding back. Someone was watching me. Either Bogdan himself or someone reporting to him. The 2 men outside, maybe. I walked to the window and looked down at the courtyard, half expecting to see them staring up at me, but it was empty. I decided to go out and clear my head, maybe find a cafe with Wi-Fi and do some research on the area. But when I went to open the front door, I noticed something that made me stop cold. The lock, this old brass thing with a deadbolt, had scratches around the keyhole that I was certain were not there before. Fresh scratches, bright metal showing through the darker patina, and the door frame near the latch had a small dent, like someone had tried to pry it open with a flathead screwdriver or something similar. I crouched down and looked closer. The wood was splintered slightly, tiny pieces on the floor that I must have stepped over when I came in last night without noticing. Someone had tried to force their way into the apartment. While I was inside, while I was sleeping, my mind raced through possibilities. Maybe it happened before I arrived, but the scratches looked fresh. Maybe I was wrong about them not being there, but I had examined the lock when I first got the key, checking that it worked properly. Those marks were new. I grabbed my passport, my wallet, and my phone, shoved them in my jacket, and left the apartment. I needed to report this to someone. Anyone official. I used my translation app to figure out where the nearest police station was, about a 15-minute walk toward the center of town. The morning was bright, and the streets had more people now, locals going about their business, and I started to feel a bit calmer. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe Bogdan had sent someone to check on the apartment and they had trouble with the lock. There had to be an explanation. The police station was a small building with a faded sign I could not read. And inside there was a front desk with a woman in uniform who looked up at me with zero expression. I tried to explain in English what happened, showing her photos I had taken of the lock and the door frame. She called over a male officer who spoke a little English, and I went through it all again. The scratches, the message from the host, the men watching me. He listened, nodded, then exchanged a look with the woman that I did not like at all. The officer told me I probably misunderstood the situation, that old buildings have old locks and scratches are normal, that the host was probably just being friendly, checking on his guest. He suggested maybe I was tired from traveling and seeing things that were not there. His tone was not rude exactly, but dismissive in a way that felt deliberate, like he was reading from a script. I asked if they could at least send someone to look at the door, to document the damage. He said they were very busy, that this was not a priority matter, that I should talk to my host about getting the lock fixed. The woman behind the desk had gone back to her paperwork and was not even looking at me anymore. I stood there for a moment not knowing what else to say. I thanked them, which felt stupid, and walked out. The sun was still bright, but the streets did not feel safe anymore. I had this growing certainty that I was completely alone in whatever was happening, that no one was going to help me, and that going back to that apartment was a terrible idea. But my stuff was there. My laptop, my clothes, my charger. I could not just leave everything behind. I stopped at a small grocery store and bought water and some food, enough for a day, thinking maybe I could just stay inside and book a bus or train out of there for the next morning. I would eat the cost of the remaining nights. I did not care. When I got back to the building, I checked the entrance carefully before going in. No one around. I climbed the stairs fast, got inside the apartment, and locked the door behind me. Deadbolt, chain, everything. I pushed a chair against the door too, which felt paranoid but also necessary. Then I sat on the bed and started searching for transportation out of town. The Wi-Fi was slow and kept cutting out, and the booking sites were confusing, half in the local language even when I switched to English. I finally found a bus leaving at 7 the next morning, about 10 hours away, and booked a ticket. I just had to make it through one more night. That was all. One more night and I would be gone. I messaged Bogdan saying I had a family emergency and needed to leave early, hoping that would explain my sudden departure without raising suspicion. He read it, but again did not reply. Around 4 in the afternoon, someone knocked on the door. 3 firm knocks, official sounding. I stayed quiet, not moving from the bed. Then a voice, a man speaking in accented English. He said he was police, that he needed to verify my documents, routine check for foreign visitors. My first thought was relief. Maybe the station had sent someone after all. But then I remembered the officer saying they were too busy, that it was not a priority. I got up slowly and looked through the peephole. A man in a dark uniform stood in the hallway, but something was wrong. The uniform did not look like what the officers at the station were wearing. Different color, no visible badge. He knocked again and repeated himself, saying he needed my passport for verification, that it would only take a minute. I asked him to slide his identification under the door. There was a pause. Then he said it was not necessary, that I should just open the door and this would be quick. His tone had changed, harder now, impatient. I told him I would call the station to confirm. Another pause, longer this time. Then footsteps, walking away. I watched through the peephole until he disappeared down the stairs. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my phone and tried to find the number for the police station. But when I finally got through, the woman who answered did not understand my English, and I could not make the translation app work fast enough. I gave up after a few minutes of useless back and forth. An hour later, maybe a bit more, I got a message from Bogdan. This time he wrote that I owed additional fees, something about local tourist taxes that were not included in the original booking. He said it was 200 euros and that someone would come to collect it this evening. I knew it was fake. I had researched the area before booking and there were no such fees, nothing like that amount anyway. I typed back saying I had already paid everything through the app and would not be paying anything else. He responded immediately this time. Just one line. Better you pay. Easier for everyone. I stared at those words for a long time. It was not a suggestion. It was a threat. I looked around the small apartment, at the chair still pushed against the door, at the window facing the courtyard, at my suitcase half packed on the floor. The sun was starting to go down and the room was getting darker. I thought about calling the embassy, but I did not even know if there was one in this country, or how long it would take them to do anything. I thought about just grabbing my bag and running to the bus station, spending the night there if I had to. But the bus did not leave until 7 in the morning, and I did not know if the station was even open overnight or safe to stay in. Around 9 that night they came. I heard them before I saw anything, footsteps on the stairs, more than one person, and then they stopped outside my door. A soft knock, almost polite, then a voice I recognized, the same accent as the fake officer but different, rougher. He said my name, pronounced it wrong but close enough. Said they were there to collect what I owed, that I should open the door and we could sort this out like adults. I did not answer, did not move. Another knock, harder this time. Then the second voice, the one I had not heard before, said something in their language to the first guy. I heard what sounded like metal touching metal near the lock. They were trying to get in. I grabbed my phone and did the only thing I could think of. I started a video, pointed it at the door, and said out loud in English that I was recording, that I had contacted my embassy, that people knew where I was. Complete lies, all of it. But I said it loud and clear. The sound stopped. Silence for maybe 10 seconds that felt like an hour. Then the first voice again, calm now, almost amused. He said, okay, no problem. Said I should enjoy my stay. And then footsteps again, going down, getting quieter until I could not hear them anymore. I sat on the floor with my back against the bed, phone still recording, and I did not move for the rest of the night. I did not sleep. I barely blinked. I just sat there in the dark, watching the strip of light under the door, waiting for the shadows to come back. They never did. At 5 in the morning, when the sky started getting light, I grabbed my suitcase and left everything else behind. Charger, some clothes, a book I had been reading. I did not care. I walked to the bus station through empty streets, jumping at every sound, every person I passed. The station was open, a few other travelers sitting on benches looking half asleep. I found a corner where I could see all the entrances, and I waited. The bus came at 7, exactly on time, and I got on without looking back. I did not feel safe until we crossed the border into the next country, 3 hours later. Even then, I kept checking behind me, kept expecting to see that tall man in the dark jacket or the one with the shaved head. But they were gone. Or maybe they just found someone else. I never reported it to anyone, not properly. Who would I report it to? The police were useless or complicit. The rental app sent me a generic response when I complained. Something about investigating the matter, and the listing stayed up for months after. I checked. Bogdan even left me a review, 1 star, saying I was a difficult guest who left without paying what I owed. I did not respond. I just deleted my account and tried to forget any of it happened. But I still think about those footsteps stopping outside my door. I still hear that voice saying my name, and I still wonder what would have happened if I had opened it. Renting out my basement seemed like the smartest financial decision after my divorce finalized in early 2023. My daughter had just started college at Ohio State, and between tuition payments and the mortgage on a house I probably should have sold, the extra income from short-term rentals felt like a lifeline. The basement suite was perfect for it. Separate entrance through the side gate, its own bathroom, a small kitchenette I had installed myself over one weekend. My buddies from the fire station where I worked as a dispatcher thought I was crazy for letting strangers sleep 15 feet below my bedroom. But after hosting maybe 40 or 50 guests over 8 months without a single issue, I figured I had the system down. Background checks, verified profiles, a strict no parties policy written in bold on the listing. What could go wrong with a couple booking a weekend for a work trip, right? They showed up on a Friday afternoon in late October, and I remember thinking they looked almost too ordinary. The man introduced himself as Craig, mid-40s maybe, with a firm handshake and the kind of forgettable face you see in insurance commercials. The woman beside him, Tamara, she said, barely made eye contact, just smiled politely while clutching a leather overnight bag against her chest like it contained something precious. They drove a silver Nissan Altima with Kentucky plates. Nothing flashy, nothing suspicious. I gave them the standard tour, showed them how to work the thermostat, pointed out the fire extinguisher under the sink because old habits die hard. Craig asked about the neighborhood, whether it was quiet at night, and I told him this was the most boring street in Columbus. Nothing ever happened here. He laughed at that, this short little chuckle that seemed genuine enough at the time. I handed over the keys and told them to enjoy their stay, then went upstairs to heat up leftover pasta and watch the Buckeyes lose another game. If I had paid closer attention to the way Tamara kept glancing at the windows, measuring them with her eyes, maybe I would have seen what was coming. Friday night passed without incident. I heard them moving around down there, normal sounds, footsteps, the TV mumbling through the floorboards, water running through the pipes. Saturday morning I left early for a 12-hour shift at the station, and when I came back around 11 that night, the house was dark and quiet. I figured they had gone to bed early, maybe tired from whatever work thing brought them to town. I made myself a sandwich, answered a few texts from my daughter complaining about her roommate, and crashed hard. It was around 2 in the morning when the thumping woke me up. Not loud exactly, but rhythmic, like someone was moving furniture or dragging something heavy across the basement floor. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, telling myself it was nothing. People shuffle around at night, especially in unfamiliar places. But then I heard voices. Not just 2 voices, but several, layered on top of each other, a low hum of conversation punctuated by occasional laughter. I sat up in bed and checked my phone, half expecting a message from Craig apologizing for having a friend over. Nothing. I pulled on sweatpants and walked to the back of the house where I had installed a small security monitor that showed feeds from 3 cameras: front porch, backyard, and the side gate that led to the basement entrance. The front porch was empty, just my truck parked in the driveway under the streetlight. The backyard showed nothing but shadows and the old swing set my daughter used to love. But the side gate camera made me sit down on the edge of my bed and just stare. There were people streaming through one after another, at least a dozen that I counted in the span of 2 minutes. Men and women, some carrying bags, some carrying nothing, all of them disappearing around the corner toward the basement door. None of them looked up at the camera. They knew exactly where they were going, like they had done this before. I watched a guy in a black hoodie prop the gate open with a brick so it would not swing shut, making it easier for whoever came next. My listing specifically said maximum 2 guests. I had charged Craig for 2 people. And now there were at least 15 strangers in my basement, and I had no idea what they were doing down there. I spent the next hour going back and forth with myself about what to do. Part of me wanted to march down there and demand everyone leave, but another part, the part that had worked emergency dispatch long enough to hear how quickly situations turn violent, told me to wait until morning. These were not college kids throwing a house party. The people I saw on that camera moved with purpose, silent and organized. Around 3:30, the thumping stopped, and the voices faded to nothing. I finally fell into a shallow sleep with my phone clutched in my hand, the security app still open. When I woke up at 7, pale Sunday light coming through the blinds, I went straight to the back window that overlooked the yard. What I saw made me grab the windowsill just to steady myself. The grass was covered in trash, beer bottles, plastic cups, fast food wrappers scattered everywhere like confetti after a parade. But that was not the worst part. Near the fence, maybe 10 feet from my daughter's old swing set, there was a blackened circle in the grass about 3 feet wide. Scorch marks. And in the center of that circle, I could see the melted remains of fabric, clothing, maybe, or sheets, twisted into unrecognizable shapes. I threw on shoes and went outside, not even bothering with a jacket despite the October chill biting through my t-shirt. The smell hit me before I even got close to the burn site. Chemical, acrid, nothing like a normal bonfire. I crouched down and looked at the melted fabric, trying to figure out what it had been. There were buttons mixed into the ash, and what looked like a zipper fused into a warped line of metal. Someone had burned clothes down here deliberately, in the middle of the night while I slept 15 feet above them. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The trash, the scorch marks, the bottles that I now noticed were not just beer but also empty containers of rubbing alcohol and acetone. My hands were steady, but something inside my chest felt like it was vibrating at a frequency I could not control. I walked around to the side gate, still propped open with that brick, and stood in front of the basement door. I could hear movement inside, soft footsteps, someone talking in a low murmur. I knocked 3 times hard, using the side of my fist the way I learned to do back when I volunteered as a firefighter, before switching to dispatch. Craig opened the door about 6 inches, just enough for me to see half his face. He looked different than he had on Friday. His eyes were bloodshot, his jaw tight, and there was a sharpness in his expression that had not been there before. Behind him, I caught a glimpse of Tamara sitting on the edge of the bed, and next to her stood a man I had never seen, heavy-set with a shaved head and tattoos crawling up his neck. The smell coming from inside was wrong, a mix of sweat and something chemical that reminded me of the burn pile in the yard. I told Craig we needed to talk about what happened last night, that I had cameras, that I saw everything, He did not blink. He just stared at me with this flat, empty expression and said that whatever I thought I saw, I should forget about it. I told him that was not going to happen, that they had violated the rental agreement and needed to leave by noon or I was calling the police. That was when Craig leaned closer, close enough that I could smell cigarettes and something sour on his breath, and said 5 words that I can still hear perfectly when I close my eyes at night. Do not interfere with business. Then he shut the door in my face, and I heard the deadbolt slide into place. The deadbolt I had installed myself, now being used to lock me out of my own property. I went back upstairs and called the police non-emergency line, figuring this was a civil matter, an eviction situation at worst. The officer who showed up 40 minutes later was young, maybe mid-20s, with the kind of polite disinterest that told me he had already decided this was not worth his time. I showed him the pictures on my phone, walked him around to see the burn site and the trash, explained about the cameras and the crowd of people I had seen entering in the middle of the night. He nodded along, took a few notes, then knocked on the basement door himself. Craig answered with a completely different demeanor, friendly, apologetic, laughing about how they had invited a few friends over and things got a little out of hand. He called it a party dispute, a misunderstanding between neighbors, said they would clean up the yard and be out by checkout time tomorrow. The officer looked at me like I was the one causing problems. He told me that since they had a valid rental agreement through Monday morning, there was not much he could do unless I had evidence of a crime. I mentioned the chemical containers, the burned clothes, but without proof of what exactly was burned or why. It was just speculation. The officer left his card and told me to call if things escalated, but his tone made it clear he did not expect to hear from me again. I spent the rest of Sunday afternoon in my living room, watching the security feeds on my laptop with the blinds drawn. The basement stayed quiet for most of the day, but I noticed Craig and the bald man leave around 4 in the afternoon, climbing into a white cargo van that I had never seen before. Not the silver Altima they arrived in. They drove off and did not come back for hours. Tamara stayed behind, and through the thin walls I could hear her talking on the phone, her voice too muffled to make out words, but the tone urgent, almost frantic at times. I thought about calling my daughter just to hear a familiar voice, but what would I even say? That I rented my basement to criminals? That I was sitting in my own house feeling like a prisoner? Around 8 o'clock, after the sun had gone down and the street had fallen into that quiet Sunday stillness, I looked at the front porch camera and felt my throat tighten. There were 2 men standing at the bottom of my driveway, right where the concrete met the sidewalk. They were not moving, not talking to each other, just standing there with their hands in their jacket pockets, staring directly at the house. One of them was tall and thin, wearing a baseball cap pulled low. The other was shorter, stockier, with a beard that caught the orange glow from the streetlight. I had never seen either of them before in my life. I watched those 2 men for almost 20 minutes, waiting for them to do something, approach the house, leave, anything. But they just stood there, motionless, their eyes fixed on my front windows like they were waiting for a signal. I turned off all the lights inside, moving through my own home in the dark like an intruder, and positioned myself near the window where I could see them without being seen. The tall one pulled out his phone at some point, looked at the screen, then showed it to the other guy. They both glanced up at the house again, and I swear the shorter one smiled. Just a quick flash of teeth that disappeared as fast as it came. Then, as if they had received some invisible command, they both turned and walked away down the sidewalk, disappearing into the shadows between streetlights. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my recliner with a baseball bat across my lap, the same one my daughter used in Little League 15 years ago, and I watched every camera feed until my eyes burned. The white cargo van returned around midnight. I saw Craig and the bald man carry something inside the basement, something wrapped in black plastic that took both of them to lift. I told myself it could be anything: equipment, supplies, furniture. I told myself a lot of things that night that I did not believe. Monday morning came gray and cold. The kind of Ohio autumn day that feels like the sky itself is pressing down on you. Checkout was supposed to be 11, and by 10:30 there was no sign of movement from the basement. I called the rental platform's emergency line and explained the situation. The unauthorized guests, the threats, the men watching my house. The representative put me on hold for 15 minutes and came back with nothing useful, just a promise to investigate and a reminder that I could file a claim for property damage. By noon, Craig and Tamara were still inside. I could hear them moving around, hear that same low murmur of voices that now included at least 2 or 3 other people. I made a decision then, probably stupid in hindsight, but I was running on no sleep and pure adrenaline. I grabbed my phone, hit record on the camera, and used my master key to open the basement door. The smell hit me first. Chemicals, stronger than before, mixed with something organic and rotten underneath. The living area looked like a bomb had gone off. Mattresses on the floor, trash everywhere, bottles and cans and food containers piled in corners. But it was the back room, the small storage space I used to keep Christmas decorations, that made me stop breathing. There were plastic containers lined up against the wall, the kind you buy at hardware stores, with handwritten labels I could not read from where I stood. The windows had been covered with black plastic sheeting, and someone had installed padlocks on the inside. Makeshift locks that would keep anyone from getting in or out. Craig appeared from the bathroom, and behind him I saw the bald man and another guy I did not recognize, younger, with nervous eyes that kept darting toward the back room. Craig told me to get out, his voice calm but carrying an edge that felt like a blade against my throat. I held up my phone and told him I had already called the police again, that they were on their way, that whatever they were doing down here was over. It was a bluff. I had not called anyone yet, but something in my voice must have convinced him. He looked at the other 2 men, some kind of silent communication passing between them, and then he smiled. Not a friendly smile, but the smile of someone who knows something you do not. He told me to check the wall by the bed before I made any more threats. Then all 3 of them walked past me, close enough that the bald man's shoulder brushed mine, and they went out the side door without another word. I heard car doors slam, an engine start, and then they were gone. I stood there in that destroyed basement, my phone still recording, and I walked over to the wall Craig had mentioned. Someone had scratched words into the drywall with something sharp, deep gouges that went through the paint and into the plaster beneath. 5 words that I can still see when I close my eyes. "We know you live upstairs." I called the real police this time, not the non-emergency line, but 911, and I told them everything. 2 officers came first, then a detective, then a whole team of people in plain clothes who took one look at the back room and made everyone else step outside. They found traces of methamphetamine production in those containers, enough chemical residue to charge someone with manufacturing if they ever caught them. The black plastic on the windows, the padlocks, the burned clothes in the yard, it all pointed to a mobile drug operation, the kind that sets up in short-term rentals for a few days and disappears before anyone catches on. The detective told me I was lucky, that these people had done this before in other cities, and that the homeowners who asked too many questions usually ended up with more than scratched drywall. They dusted for fingerprints, took samples, photographed everything, but Craig and Tamara, if those were even their real names, had used fake identification to book the rental. The silver Altima had been stolen from a parking garage in Kentucky 3 weeks earlier. The white cargo van was found abandoned 2 days later at a rest stop near Indianapolis, wiped clean. Nobody was ever arrested. The case went cold within a month. I sold the house in February of 2024, took a loss on it just to get out fast. My daughter asked me why I was moving into an apartment when I'd always said I would die in that house, and I told her I just needed a change of scenery. I never told her about the message on the wall, about the men standing at the bottom of the driveway, about the nights I spent awake with a baseball bat waiting for footsteps that never came. Some things you carry alone because sharing them would only spread the weight to people you love. I still check behind me when I walk to my car at night. I still look at every silver Nissan on the highway and wonder. The new apartment has no basement, no extra rooms, no space for guests of any kind. Sometimes I wake up at 2 in the morning and lie there in the dark, listening for thumping through walls that do not exist, voices that are not there. The police told me those people probably forgot about me the moment they drove away, that I was just another mark, another temporary stop on whatever criminal highway they travel. Maybe that is true, but I remember the way Craig smiled before he left, the way he told me to check the wall like he was giving me a gift. They wanted me to find that message. They wanted me to know that even in my own home, I was never really alone. And some nights, when the apartment is too quiet and the shadows stretch too long, I still do not feel alone. And that is the part that keeps me awake. After 7 years of grinding through tax season after tax season at an accounting firm in Denver, I had finally done it, saved enough for a real trip. Not some weekend getaway to Vegas, or a cruise with watered-down drinks, but an actual solo adventure through Portugal. My sister thought I was crazy for traveling alone at 26, but something about wandering through cobblestone streets with no itinerary felt like the reset I desperately needed. I landed in Lisbon on a Wednesday morning in late September 2024, jet-lagged but buzzing with that particular kind of excitement you only get when everything is unfamiliar. The plan was simple: spend 3 days in the capital, then head to Porto for another 4 before flying home. I had booked accommodations through Airbnb, choosing places that looked authentic rather than touristy. For Porto, I found what seemed like a steal: a private room inside a 19th century townhouse in the Ribeira district, hosted by a man named Gaspar who had dozens of 5-star reviews praising his hospitality and local recommendations. When I arrived at the address on that Sunday afternoon, the house exceeded my expectations in ways that made me giddy. It sat on a narrow street that wound up from the Douro River, its blue and white azulejo tiles gleaming in the autumn sun. Gaspar greeted me at the heavy wooden door with a warm handshake and a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He was perhaps in his early 60s, with thick gray hair combed back, and a neatly trimmed beard that gave him an almost grandfatherly appearance. His English was broken but enthusiastic, peppered with Portuguese phrases he would then translate with exaggerated hand gestures. He insisted on carrying my suitcase up the creaking staircase, pointing out family photographs on the walls: his late wife, his daughter who lived in Brazil, his grandchildren he saw only on video calls. The room itself was charming: high ceilings with exposed wooden beams, a wrought iron bed covered in crisp white linens, and a window that overlooked a tiny courtyard filled with potted lemon trees. He handed me an ornate brass key and then, almost as an afterthought, mentioned he would keep a spare in the kitchen drawer, just for safety, in case I ever locked myself out. The first 2 days passed like a dream. I wandered through the Livraria Lello, ate francesinha at a tiny restaurant where the owner kissed my cheeks like I was family, and watched the sunset paint the Douro River in shades of copper and rose. Gaspar was attentive in a way I initially found endearing. He would ask about my plans each morning over coffee, recommending hidden gems and warning me about pickpockets near the train station. But by the second evening, his questions became more specific. Where exactly was I going? What time would I return? Had I told anyone back home about staying here? I brushed it off as cultural difference, maybe even loneliness from an old man whose family lived an ocean away. When I mentioned I was meeting a group from my hostel in Lisbon for dinner, he frowned slightly and said it was dangerous for a woman to walk alone after dark. He offered to wait up for me, to make sure I got home safe. I thanked him, but declined, laughing nervously as I grabbed my jacket and headed out into the cool evening air. That night I came back earlier than expected, around 9:30 instead of 11, because one of the girls in the group had gotten food poisoning and everyone decided to call it an early night. The narrow street was quiet except for a television flickering blue through a neighbor's window. I unlocked the front door as quietly as I could, not wanting to disturb Gaspar if he had already gone to bed. But as I climbed the stairs, I heard footsteps above me, quick and shuffling. followed by the distinct creak of my bedroom door. My heart began pounding against my ribs as I reached the landing. There, standing in my doorway with my backpack clutched against his chest, was Gaspar. For a moment, neither of us moved. His expression shifted through several emotions: surprise, something that looked almost like fear, and then a smile that spread too slowly across his face. He explained, his voice overly casual, that he had noticed my window was not closing properly and wanted to check on it before the rain came. He set my backpack down on the bed, patted it twice like it was a sleeping pet, and wished me a good night before shuffling past me down the hallway. I stood there for what felt like minutes, my pulse thundering in my ears, trying to convince myself that I had misread the situation entirely. I barely slept that night. Every creak of the old house made me jolt awake, and I found myself staring at the gap beneath my door, watching for shadows. I had pushed the heavy wooden dresser in front of it before getting into bed, telling myself I was being paranoid, that Gaspar was just an odd but harmless old man. But when morning light finally crept through the curtains, I checked my backpack and found everything seemingly in place: my passport, my wallet, my emergency cash hidden in a zippered pocket inside my toiletry bag. Nothing was missing. I almost laughed at myself, at the dramatic American girl who watched too many true crime documentaries. I decided I would stay the remaining 2 nights as planned, but keep my distance from Gaspar, spend more time out of the house, maybe even find a cafe with Wi-Fi where I could work on editing the hundreds of photos cluttering my phone. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand to check my messages, and that was when I noticed it. The small tray on the side of the device was slightly ajar, and when I pulled it open, the slot was empty. My SIM card, my only connection to calling and texting without Wi-Fi, was sitting neatly on the wooden desk across the room, propped against the base of a ceramic lamp like someone had placed it there deliberately for me to find. My mind raced through explanations that made sense. Maybe I had taken it out myself and forgotten. Maybe it had fallen out somehow and Gaspar had found it on the floor and placed it there for me. But I knew neither of those things was true. I remembered using my phone to text my sister right before falling asleep. Remembered the little green bubble confirming the message had sent. Someone had removed that SIM card while I slept, while the dresser blocked the door, which meant they had either moved the furniture without waking me, or they had come through another way. I walked to the window and examined the latch. It was old, the kind that could be jimmied open with a butter knife, and the frame showed faint scratches that I had not noticed before. My stomach twisted into a knot so tight I thought I might be sick. I shoved the SIM card back into my phone with trembling fingers and immediately tried to book a taxi to the airport. I did not care about the remaining nights I had paid for. I did not care about the non-refundable reservation or the carefully planned itinerary. I just needed to leave this house, this street, this city that had transformed overnight from charming to suffocating. The first taxi I requested through the app accepted my ride, and I watched the little car icon on the screen begin moving toward my location. I started throwing clothes into my suitcase without folding them, shoving toiletries into side pockets, not caring about organization or wrinkles or any of the meticulous packing habits I normally obsessed over. Then, about 3 minutes before arrival, the driver canceled. No explanation, just a notification that my ride was no longer available. I requested another one. A different driver accepted, and again I watched the icon approach on the map, getting closer and closer until it was practically on top of my pin. Then he canceled too. I tried a third time with the same result. Acceptance, approach, cancellation. On the fourth attempt, I watched the car actually turn onto my street, pause for nearly a minute, and then make a sharp U-turn before the cancellation notification appeared. I stood at my window looking down at the narrow road, my suitcase zipped and waiting by the door, and I saw the white sedan disappear around the corner like it was fleeing from something. I switched to a different taxi app, one of the local Portuguese services I had downloaded as a backup. The first driver who accepted sent me a message almost immediately. "This address? You are sure?" I typed back, "Yes, please hurry. He canceled 30 seconds later without another word. I finally went downstairs, thinking maybe I could walk to a busier street and hail a cab the old-fashioned way. Gaspar was sitting at the kitchen table with a newspaper spread in front of him and a small cup of espresso steaming by his elbow. He looked up when I appeared with my suitcase and something flickered across his face. Not surprise exactly, but a kind of resigned disappointment, like a parent catching a teenager sneaking out past curfew. He asked if I was leaving early, and I told him there was a family emergency back home, that I needed to catch the next flight to Denver. He nodded slowly, folding his newspaper with deliberate care, and said that was very unfortunate because the neighborhood had been having some problems lately. Problems with what? I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I intended. He waved his hand vaguely and mentioned something about break-ins, about strangers asking questions, about how it was not safe for a young woman to be wandering around alone with luggage. He offered to call someone for me, a friend who had a car who could take me to the airport for a fair price. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to refuse, to walk out that door and take my chances on the street. But the memory of those 4 taxi drivers canceling, of that white sedan fleeing like my address was cursed, made me hesitate just long enough for Gaspar to pick up his phone and dial. He spoke in rapid Portuguese, too fast for me to catch more than a few words. Americana, aeroporto, agora. When he hung up, he smiled and told me his friend would arrive in about an hour, that I should relax and have some tea while I waited. An hour felt like an eternity, but what choice did I have? I sat in the living room with my suitcase beside me like a loyal dog, declining the tea he offered 3 separate times. Gaspar settled into an armchair across from me and watched a football match on a small television mounted in the corner, though I noticed his eyes kept drifting toward me, toward the front door, toward the window facing the street. The afternoon light began to fade, and the hours stretched into 2. I asked about his friend, and he assured me he was coming, that Porto traffic was terrible, that I should be patient. By the time the sun dipped below the terracotta rooftops, I knew no one was coming to take me to the airport. I stood up and announced I was going to walk to the main road and find my own transportation. Gaspar rose from his chair faster than I would have thought possible for a man his age, positioning himself between me and the door, with his hands raised in a gesture that was probably meant to be calming, but felt like a wall. Outside, dogs had begun barking. Not just 1 or 2, but what sounded like every dog in the neighborhood, a chorus of frantic yelping that rose and fell in waves. I moved to the window and pulled back the lace curtain, and what I saw made my breath catch in my throat. 2 cars were parked on the narrow street below, both dark sedans with their engines running, exhaust puffing white in the cooling evening air. I could see silhouettes inside, 2 people in the front car, at least 3 in the back one. But their features were obscured by the fading light and the tinted windows. They were not moving, not getting out, just waiting. I turned to Gaspar and demanded to know who they were, what was happening, why I could not leave. He looked at me with an expression I will never forget, a mixture of pity and fear that seemed genuine, that made him look suddenly very old and very tired. He shuffled toward the staircase and gestured for me to follow him back to my room. When I refused, he leaned in close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath and the faint mustiness of his wool sweater. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he said the words that still echo in my nightmares. "You cannot leave tonight. People are asking about you." I grabbed his arm and demanded answers. Who was asking? What did they want? What had he done? Gaspar pulled away and sank into a chair like a man defeated by something far larger than himself. In halting English mixed with Portuguese I could barely follow, he explained that he owed money to certain people, the kind of people who did not take no for an answer, the kind who noticed when young foreign women with American passports stayed alone in houses they controlled. He swore he had not meant for any of this to happen, that he had only mentioned me in passing, that he thought they just wanted to look at my documents to see if I was worth anything. Worth anything? Those words hung in the air like poison. He said the men outside had been watching since yesterday, that they had connections at the taxi companies, that the whole neighborhood knew better than to interfere. I felt the walls closing in, felt the ancient house transform from a charming relic into a cage, with blue tiles and lemon trees. But beneath the terror, something else ignited. A cold, sharp fury that burned through the panic and left me thinking with terrible clarity. I told Gaspar I needed to use the bathroom, and he nodded wearily, too broken to suspect anything. I locked myself in the small washroom off the kitchen, pulled out my phone, and connected to his Wi-Fi. My fingers flew across the screen as I opened every app I could think of. I messaged the American Embassy emergency line on Facebook. I emailed the consulate with my location and a desperate plea for help. I posted in a travel safety group with my exact address and a photo of the street I had taken days earlier. And I sent my sister a voice message explaining everything in case it was the last thing she ever heard from me. Then I did something that probably saved my life. I found the local Porto police emergency contact online and sent them a WhatsApp message with my passport photo, my location pin, and a frantic explanation that I was being held against my will by people who wanted to traffic me. I did not know if they would respond, did not know if WhatsApp was even a legitimate way to contact law enforcement, but I had nothing left to lose. I stayed in that bathroom for nearly 40 minutes, refreshing my messages, listening to the muffled sounds of Gaspar pacing in the kitchen and the dogs still barking outside. And then, like a miracle, I heard sirens. Distant at first, then closer, then right outside the window. I heard car doors slamming, engines revving, and tires screeching as the dark sedans fled into the night. I heard shouting in Portuguese, heard Gaspar's voice high and panicked, heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. When the police knocked on the bathroom door and called out in accented English that I was safe, I collapsed onto the cold tile floor and sobbed harder than I have ever sobbed in my life. They escorted me out of that house within the hour, took my statement at the station until nearly 3 in the morning, and put me on a flight back to Denver the next afternoon with a police escort to the gate. I never learned exactly who those men were or what would have happened if the sirens had not come. Gaspar was arrested, though I do not know what charges stuck or if he is still in prison. What I do know is that I have not traveled alone since, that I check the locks on my apartment 4 times before bed, and that sometimes, when a car idles too long on my street, I feel that same cold dread wrap around my chest like a fist. I survived something that night in Porto, something I still do not fully understand, and the only reason I am here to tell you this story is because I trusted my instincts and fought back with the only weapon I had, a phone and a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, was listening. My company sent me to Austin for a software training conference back in March of 2018. 4 days, all expenses paid, which sounded great until I saw the hotel options they approved. $60 a night in downtown Austin gets you a room that smells like cigarette smoke and desperation. So I did what most people my age do now and booked a rental apartment instead. Found a nice-looking place about 6 blocks from the convention center. Modern building, great reviews, hosted by a guy named Craig who had over 200 5-star ratings. The listing photos showed this sleek 1-bedroom unit with floor-to-ceiling windows, a kitchen island with bar stools and a sofa bed in the living area. $90 a night, way better than the motel options. I messaged Craig a few questions about check-in. He responded within minutes, super friendly. Seemed like a solid choice. My girlfriend even joked that she wished she could come along because the place looked nicer than our actual apartment back in Columbus. I got to Austin around 3 in the afternoon after a connecting flight through Dallas. Craig had set up one of those keypad locks, so I just punched in the code he texted me and let myself in. The apartment looked exactly like the photos, which is always a relief with these rentals. Clean, modern, that generic IKEA furniture vibe, but in a good way. Big windows overlooking a courtyard, decent natural light. I dropped my suitcase in the bedroom, checked out the bathroom, opened the fridge to see if there was anything inside. Standard stuff, a few condiment packets, bottled water, a welcome note on the counter with the Wi-Fi password and some restaurant recommendations. I remember thinking this was going to be a smooth trip. I had the rest of the afternoon free before the conference started the next morning, so I figured I would grab dinner somewhere nearby, maybe walk around a bit. That was the plan anyway. I wish I had just stayed in some crappy hotel instead. I came back from dinner around 8, full from some decent barbecue at a place a few blocks away. The sun was setting and the apartment had that warm orange glow from the windows. I kicked off my shoes, grabbed a beer from the welcome pack Craig had left in the fridge, and settled onto the sofa bed to watch something on my laptop. That is when I first noticed the motion sensors. There were 3 of them mounted in different spots around the main living area. Small, white rectangular boxes about the size of a deck of cards. One near the front door, one in the hallway leading to the bedroom, and one mounted on the wall right next to the kitchen island, maybe 7 feet up. I figured they were part of the security system, the kind that triggers an alarm if someone breaks in. The listing had mentioned the building had good security features, so I did not think much of it. But I remember glancing at the one near the kitchen and noticing its little LED light was blinking green every few seconds. The other 2 had solid red lights, no blinking. I thought maybe it was a different model or something. Did not give it more than a passing thought. Around 11, I was getting ready for bed when the power in the apartment flickered. Just for a second, lights went out and came back on. Probably nothing unusual for an older building, except this place was supposed to be recently renovated. I was standing in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I noticed the motion sensor near the island again. The power had just flickered off, but that green light was still blinking. Same rhythm, same interval. That struck me as weird because if the power cut out, even for a second, should not the sensor reset or go dark? I stood there watching it for maybe 30 seconds, and it just kept doing its thing. Blink, pause, blink, pause. I walked over to the one by the front door and its red light had gone solid again after the flicker, like it had rebooted. Same with the hallway one. But the kitchen sensor kept blinking like nothing had happened. I am not a paranoid person by nature, but something about that inconsistency got stuck in my head. I told myself it was probably just a battery backup or a different brand. I went to bed, but I kept thinking about that blinking light in the dark. The next morning I woke up early, around 6, even though my first session at the conference was not until 9. I made coffee using the little machine on the counter and found myself staring at that sensor again. In the daylight, I could see it more clearly. It looked newer than the other 2. The plastic was shinier, less dusty. The other sensors had that slightly yellowed look that white electronics get after a couple years. This one looked like it had been installed recently. I pulled one of the bar stools over and climbed up to get a closer look. The sensor by the front door had a small logo on it, some security company brand I did not recognize, and a serial number sticker. The hallway one had the same, but the kitchen one was different. No logo, no serial number, just a plain white casing with a tiny dark circle in the center that I had not noticed before. I remember my heart started beating a little faster when I saw that circle. It was maybe the size of a pencil eraser, slightly recessed into the plastic. I told myself it was probably just a light sensor or an infrared detector. Motion sensors have those, right? But why would this one look so different from the others? I got down from the stool and grabbed my phone. I typed the brand name from the other sensors into a search and found the security company website. They made basic home security equipment, motion detectors, door alarms, that kind of stuff. I looked at their product catalog and found models that matched the sensors by the door and hallway perfectly. Then I searched for one that matched the kitchen unit. Nothing. Not a single product on their site looked like that plain white box with the little dark circle. I went back to the listing page for the apartment and read through the description again. Craig had written that the unit featured a smart security system with motion detection. I scrolled through the photos and found one shot of the living room from an angle that showed the kitchen area. I zoomed in as much as my phone would let me. The photo was from maybe a year ago based on the listing date. In that picture, there was no sensor mounted near the kitchen island, just bare wall. My mouth went dry. That sensor had been added sometime in the last year, and it was not the same brand as the rest of the system. I skipped breakfast. I was supposed to be at the convention center in 2 hours, but I could not stop thinking about that device on the wall. I pulled the bar stool over again and climbed up, this time with my phone flashlight on. I angled the light directly at that little dark circle, and my stomach turned. Through the tiny opening, I could see the unmistakable glint of glass, a lens. I had worked briefly at an electronics store during college, and I knew what camera lenses looked like, even miniature ones. This was not a motion sensor. I climbed down and sat on the stool for a while, just processing. My mind was racing through possibilities. Maybe Craig had a legitimate reason. Maybe it was for security in case of break-ins. But why would he hide it? Why make it look like the other sensors? And why point it directly at the living area where the sofa bed was, where I had been sitting in my underwear the night before watching videos on my laptop? I felt sick. I actually felt physically sick, like I needed to throw up. I went to the bathroom and splashed water on my face, trying to calm down and think clearly about what to do next. I decided I needed to know for sure before doing anything drastic. I grabbed a butter knife from the kitchen drawer and climbed back up on the stool. The device was mounted with 2 small screws. Phillips head, nothing complicated. I hesitated for a second, thinking about whether I was allowed to tamper with the host's property. Then I thought about someone watching me sleep, and I stopped caring about the deposit. The screws came out easily, too easily, like they had been removed before. The device popped off the wall and I held it in my hands. It was light, maybe a few ounces. I turned it over and found a small label on the back with a model number and a brand name I recognized immediately: NannyCam Pro. I had seen these advertised online, marketed to parents who want to keep an eye on babysitters, or to people who suspect their spouse is cheating. Wireless, battery-powered, connects to an app on your phone so you can watch the feed remotely. The battery explained why it kept blinking during the power outage. This thing was not connected to the apartment security system at all. It was streaming video to someone's phone, and that someone had positioned it to capture everything happening on the sofa bed and kitchen area. I took photos of everything: the device, the label, the spot on the wall where it had been mounted, the 2 screws. I even took a video of myself turning the camera over and showing the NannyCam Pro branding. My hands were not steady, but I got the footage I needed. Then I sat down and messaged Craig through the rental app. I kept it simple. Said I found a camera hidden in the living room and asked him to explain. He responded within 5 minutes, which told me he had probably seen me remove it from the wall through the live feed. His message was calm, almost rehearsed. He said I must be confused, that it was just a heat sensor for the smart thermostat system. Nothing to worry about. He even added a smiley face emoji at the end. A smiley face. I typed back that I had removed it and found the NannyCam label on the back. There was a long pause, maybe 10 minutes, where he did not respond. I just sat there staring at my phone, waiting. When he finally replied, his tone had shifted. He said the previous tenant must have installed it and he had no idea it was there. He apologized for the confusion and offered me a partial refund for the inconvenience. I almost laughed at that response. The previous tenant installed a wireless camera that was still actively streaming to someone's device, and Craig had no idea. The thing was blinking green, clearly powered on and functioning, and his first response was that it was a heat sensor, not that he did not know about it. He changed his story the moment I proved I knew what it actually was. I told him I was not interested in a partial refund and that I was going to report this to the police. He started calling me immediately, back-to-back 5 calls in a row. I did not answer. He sent more messages saying we could work this out, that there was no need to involve anyone else, that he would refund the entire stay and give me a credit for a future booking. The desperation in his messages made my skin prickle. This was not the reaction of someone who had just learned about a camera in his property. This was someone trying to make a problem disappear. I blocked his number on my phone and called the Austin Police Department non-emergency line. The woman who answered sounded tired, but she perked up when I explained what I had found. She told me to stay where I was and that an officer would come to take a report. 2 officers showed up about 40 minutes later, a man and a woman, both pretty young. I showed them the camera, the photos, the messages from Craig. The female officer, whose name tag said Fuentes, examined the device and nodded slowly like she had seen this before. She told me that hidden cameras in short-term rentals had become a growing problem, that they got a few reports like this every month. She asked if I had changed clothes in the living room area or done anything private. I thought about the night before, how I had stripped down to my boxers because the apartment was warm, how I had video called my girlfriend before bed while sitting on the sofa. My face must have gone pale because Officer Fuentes put her hand on my shoulder and told me they would take this seriously. They confiscated the camera as evidence and took my statement. The male officer made some calls and found out that Craig owned 3 other rental units in the Austin area. 3 other apartments where he could have done the same thing. They told me I should find somewhere else to stay for the rest of my trip and that a detective would follow up with me in the coming days. I packed my bag in about 4 minutes and got out of there. I ended up at a chain hotel near the airport, $70 a night, ugly carpet and all. I did not care. I checked every corner of that room twice before I even sat down on the bed. The detective called me 2 weeks later, after I was already back home in Columbus. She told me they had executed a search warrant on Craig's residence and found external hard drives containing footage from multiple properties going back almost 2 years. Hundreds of hours of video, guests sleeping, getting dressed, being intimate with partners. She could not tell me if I was on any of those recordings, said it was part of an ongoing investigation. Craig was arrested and charged with multiple counts of voyeurism, but I never found out what happened after that. I searched for news articles, court records, anything, but his name never showed up in any public reports. Maybe he took a plea deal, maybe the case is still pending. I genuinely do not know. What I do know is that I think about that little green blinking light more often than I want to admit. Every hotel room, every rental, every friend's guest room, I find myself scanning the walls and ceilings before I can relax. My girlfriend and I went to a cabin in Michigan last fall, and I spent the first hour unscrewing smoke detectors and checking behind mirrors. She says I have become paranoid. Maybe she is right. But someone watched me in my underwear, watched me sleep, watched me have a private video call with the person I love. And there might be a recording of it on some hard drive in an evidence locker somewhere in Texas. That is not paranoia. That is just knowing what people are capable of when they think no one is paying attention. A bag full of camera gear and a deadline to meet had pushed me to book a last-minute stay at a restored carriage house attached to an old estate. At the time, life felt like a patchwork of shoots, edits, and travel, and I'd gotten used to working from whatever room I happened to land in. This place had that curated historic charm vibe. Exposed beams, polished floors, the smell of furniture wax lingering in the air. The only thing that didn't quite match was a wooden panel hanging on the wall across from the bed. Everything else looked like it belonged in a boutique magazine spread, but that panel had a dull, uneven finish, like it had been carved by hand and forgotten for decades. I remember thinking it looked staged, but not in a designer way. More like someone wanted it there for a reason they weren't explaining. I'd unpacked just enough to prep for a video call with a client, trying to get the lighting right so I wouldn't look like I was dialing in from inside a cave. I shifted my lamp a few inches, then a few more, and that's when my attention drifted back to the panel. One of the carved cutouts caught the light in a strange way, not a reflection, more like something inside the hollow shape shifted for a split second. At first I chalked it up to glare bouncing off the lamp, but the more I stared at it, the more I realized the faint flicker came from deeper than the surface. It made my chest tighten in that uneasy, instinctive way you get when you notice something that shouldn't be behaving the way it is. I walked closer, telling myself it was probably a draft or maybe a stray shadow. The carvings were oddly intricate, thin slits, diamond shapes, shallow apertures that weren't symmetrical. Up close, they gave the uncomfortable impression of being intentional in a way I couldn't place. I pushed gently on the panel, expecting it to be solidly anchored. Instead, it shifted about an inch, just enough to reveal a narrow gap in the drywall behind it. The gap wasn't symmetrical either. It looked like someone had cut through from the other side and never bothered to plaster it. I reached in with my phone flashlight, angling it until the beam slipped past the jagged edges. What it illuminated didn't look like part of any normal wall. The gap connected to a cramped, unfinished space running between the carriage house and the main building. It reminded me of those awkward architectural leftovers you only realize exist when a house gets renovated. Except this one wasn't empty. Dust coated most of the floor, but near the entry point were faint footprints, fresh enough that the shape of a heel and part of the arch were still defined. The dust around them looked recently disturbed, trailing deeper into the void, and near the closest footprint, pushed up against a beam, was a takeout container from a local diner I recognized from the drive-in. There was no dust on top of it. Someone had been in there not long before I checked in, someone small enough or determined enough to crawl through that narrow space, hidden by a panel placed directly across from the bed. I stepped back from the wall, letting the panel fall back into place, and tried to make sense of what I'd just seen. The room around me felt different now, like the air had gone still in a way I hadn't noticed before. I kept replaying the details, the disturbed dust, the clear shape of those footprints, the untouched takeout container sitting like someone had dropped it and planned to come back. The strangest part was how deliberate the panel seemed once I really paid attention to it. Its position wasn't decorative at all. It was angled just right, facing the bed with those carved openings arranged in a pattern that suddenly reminded me of camera viewports. I sat on the edge of the mattress for a moment, listening to the faint settling sounds of the old building, each creak making me wonder if it came from the void rather than the beams overhead. Eventually, I reached out to the host through the app, trying to sound calm while explaining what I'd found. She answered quickly, almost too quickly, brushing everything off like it was part of some harmless architectural quirk. "Oh, that old construction gap has been there forever," she wrote, as if that explained the fresh tracks or the takeout container that couldn't have been older than a day. When I mentioned the panel and how it didn't match the rest of the decor, she doubled down, insisting it was just a touch of historical character. But nothing about it felt historical. The edges weren't worn the way the beams were, and the screws holding it in place looked new. Her casual dismissal only made my pulse pick up, because now it felt like she either didn't know the truth or didn't want to acknowledge it. I ended the chat feeling more unsettled than before, and decided to check the panel again, this time listening carefully as I nudged it aside. The gap wasn't wide enough to climb through, but the space beyond extended far enough that someone could definitely move around in it. I angled my phone light deeper into the void, sweeping it slowly across the exposed joists and insulation. A faint glint caught my eye from farther inside, something metallic reflecting just enough to stand out. I couldn't reach it, but knowing it was there made the whole situation feel even stranger, like whoever had been in that space wasn't just hiding, they were bringing things in. Staring at that dim reflection, I couldn't shake the feeling that the panel wasn't just a cover, it was a viewport. As evening crept in, I tried to work on my project, but every so often I caught myself glancing at the panel, waiting for another flicker. The room had dimmed to that bluish hue you get when the sun drops behind the trees, and the panel's carvings seemed to absorb the light instead of reflecting it. At one point, a soft tapping sound drifted through the wall, quick, subtle, almost playful. It wasn't like the building settling. It had a rhythm to it, like someone making sure I was still aware of the panel. I set my laptop aside and stood completely still, straining to hear anything else. The tapping didn't continue, but something inside that void shifted, just a small movement, a faint rustle. Enough to confirm I wasn't imagining things. Someone was in there, and they were waiting for the right moment to move again. Night settled over the property in a way that made the carriage house feel detached from the rest of the world. The estate's exterior lights barely reached my windows, leaving most of the room in a muted haze. I tried distracting myself with editing work, but every sound felt amplified. The hum of my charger, the faint rattle of the old pipes, even the distant breeze threading through the trees outside. I kept glancing at that wooden panel, trying to convince myself I was being dramatic, but each time I looked, the carvings seemed slightly darker, like whatever space sat behind them was absorbing the glow of the room. I angled my lamp away from it, hoping not to catch another flicker, but that only made the rest of the wall seem to recede into a deeper shadow. After an hour of trying to ignore the unease creeping into my thoughts, I decided to message a friend who lived a few states over. I didn't give every detail at first, just said the rental had some weird construction stuff and that I wasn't loving the energy in the room. She asked if the place had good reviews, and I told her it did, though now I wondered how many people had actually inspected the walls. While we talked, I kept pacing between the bed and the kitchenette, never letting my back face the panel for too long. Halfway through typing a message, I heard a soft scrape from inside the wall. Not loud, not aggressive, just enough to make my breath catch. The timing felt deliberate, like whoever was inside knew I'd been trying to reach someone. I moved closer again, phone in hand, and leaned in toward the carvings. The panel stayed still, but the temperature near that section of the wall felt noticeably cooler, as if air were passing through from a draft deeper inside the void. I held my phone's camera toward one of the carved openings, hoping maybe I could catch a glimpse of what was beyond. Instead, the screen reflected something I hadn't expected. The faint outline of another object positioned behind the panel, angled toward the room. At first I thought it was some kind of support beam, but then I realized the shape was too clean, too symmetrical. It looked like a small plastic housing, the kind used for cheap lenses or peephole kits, not built into the wall. Added. That's when a slow, steady exhale drifted through the gap. I backed up instinctively, heart pounding so hard it felt like it echoed through my ribs. The exhale wasn't forceful or threatening, but it carried the unmistakable sound of someone trying to stay quiet and failing. I stared at the panel, half expecting it to shift forward, but it didn't move. Whoever was in that hidden space was choosing not to reveal themselves, which somehow felt worse. The silence that followed stretched out so thin it felt like it could snap. I had the overwhelming sense that if I turned away for too long, the panel might not look the same when I faced it again. The gap behind it had held footprints, food, and a lens. Now it held someone breathing, watching, waiting. Calling the host again felt like the only reasonable move, even though her earlier dismissal had rattled my trust. I stepped outside onto the small porch to get distance from the panel, gripping my phone so tightly I nearly dropped it. When she picked up, her tone was strained, like she'd been expecting the call but wishing she hadn't. I explained what I had heard, every scrape, every shift, every breath, and I could tell she wanted to wave it away again, but something in my voice must have cut through her routine reassurances. After a long pause, she admitted the property had old access routes that previous owners used for maintenance. When I mentioned the fresh footprints, she stopped talking altogether. Eventually, she said she was on her way over, but her hesitation made it sound like she wasn't coming to solve a problem, just to contain it. The wait for her arrival felt endless. I stayed outside with the porch light buzzing overhead, glancing back through the window every few seconds to keep the panel in sight. The room looked perfectly still from the outside, but that made me even more nervous. It felt staged, like someone inside the wall had also gone quiet now that I was out of reach. I kept imagining the hidden space running between the buildings, twisting and narrowing, unknown corners hidden by decades of construction. Someone could crawl through all that without ever stepping foot inside the room itself. When headlights finally cut across the gravel driveway, I felt a rush of relief, brief but strong enough to push me forward. The host stepped out of her car with a flashlight in hand, avoiding eye contact as she walked toward me. She didn't ask how I was or apologize for the situation, She just told me to wait outside while she checked the interior. I couldn't let that happen. If someone was in the wall, I wasn't letting her walk into that room alone. We went in together, her flashlight scanning the floor, the corners, finally landing on the panel. Up close, even she seemed surprised by how out of place it looked. Without saying much, she tugged the panel free. Behind it, the gap yawned open, the void stretching into darkness. Her beam caught the footprints, the takeout container, and then, farther in, the glinting object I'd seen earlier. It wasn't a peephole lens. It was a small handheld camera, pointed directly toward the room. She backed away fast, breathing unevenly, and whispered that she needed to call her husband. I didn't wait to hear why. I grabbed my bag, every piece of equipment shoved in without care, and stepped outside while she stayed frozen near the wall. By the time I reached my car, she was on the phone speaking in a low, frantic tone. I drove off without looking back, not wanting to see whether something else shifted inside that void as I left. Later that night, she messaged me saying the issue had been handled and that authorities had been notified. No explanation, no detail, just a vague reassurance that didn't put anything to rest. I still don't know how long someone had been using that hidden corridor, or how many guests they watched before me. All I know is the panel wasn't there for decoration, and whoever had been behind it wasn't done until we found the camera. The Airbnb I booked that spring belonged to a family living in a quiet residential neighborhood on the edge of a small town, the kind of place where most houses had wind chimes and faded porch swings. I'd taken the trip to get a break from my cramped apartment and finish a remote work project without constant interruptions. The listing showed a separate guest suite attached to the main house, with its own entrance, and a small laundry room between the two spaces. I remember noticing how the laundry room door had a heavy old brass handle, tarnished in a pattern that looked almost like fingerprints frozen into the metal. The host, a woman named Laura, greeted me at check-in with a quick tour and a rehearsed explanation about privacy. Everything seemed straightforward, even comforting in that mild suburban way. The first couple of days passed quietly. I spent most of my time typing at the little desk next to the window, listening to distant lawnmowers and the soft hum of the fridge. It wasn't until my third morning that I noticed something in the laundry room that didn't match how I'd left it. A large bottle of detergent with a cracked blue cap had shifted a few inches to the left on the shelf. It stood out because I remembered the uneven way it leaned when I'd placed it back after washing a pair of jeans. Now it sat neatly upright, like someone had corrected its posture. At the time, I chalked it up to my memory playing games, even though I kept replaying the image of how it had looked the night before. Later that evening, I went to toss a towel into the dryer and felt a faint lingering warmth inside the drum. There were damp clothes in there, heavy flannel shirts and socks I didn't recognize, tinted with a detergent scent sharper than the one I'd brought with me. The oddest part was the pattern on one of the shirts, a faded print of a local high school mascot I'd never heard of. I stood there for a while, waiting for a clear explanation to form in my mind, but none did. The laundry room door leading to my suite was locked from my side, and the listing had stressed that the host wouldn't need to enter the space during my stay. That night, something pulled me out of sleep. Not a sudden noise, but a strange sense that the air in the room felt disturbed, like it had recently shifted. I stayed still, listening. Within a few seconds, faint footsteps reached me through the wall near the laundry room. They had a soft, dragging rhythm, almost as if the person was trying to minimize the sound of each step. Then came whispers. Two voices, one low and steady, the other barely audible, murmuring in the cramped space behind the locked door. I sat up in bed, staring at the dark outline of the laundry room entrance, wondering how many nights this had been happening without me noticing. Morning light made everything feel less alarming, though not by much. While I reheated leftover coffee in the microwave, Laura stopped by under the pretext of checking the outdoor gutter above the suite. She mentioned almost carelessly that a relative occasionally uses the back room. tapping the laundry door with her knuckles as if it were no big deal. The listing had been very clear about privacy, so her comment hit me strangely. I asked what she meant, and she just waved a hand, saying something about family routines and how the space works for everyone. Her answer didn't match the layout or the locks, and the casual tone only highlighted how rehearsed it sounded. I couldn't shake the sense that she expected me to accept the explanation without thinking too hard about it. The rest of the day, I kept finding myself glancing at the laundry door. It had a worn baseboard, and the paint around the knob was chipped in a distinct half-moon shape, as if someone with a ring had turned it repeatedly over the years. At one point, while I was sitting at the desk, I heard a short metallic click from inside, too sharp to be the house settling. I got up, pressed my ear to the door, and felt the faintest vibration against the wood, like movement was happening on the other side, and someone paused when they sensed I was close. The thought settled in my mind slowly. Whoever used that room wasn't doing laundry. They were passing through. By early evening, my nerves were stretched thin from the constant awareness of that door. I tried going for a walk to clear my head. The neighborhood felt a little strange now, too quiet, too still. When I returned, I noticed something I hadn't before: a set of scuff marks on the floor tiles near the laundry door, forming a narrow arc that suggested a heavy object being pivoted or a foot twisting for balance. They weren't mine. My shoes left a different pattern entirely. That detail stuck with me more than I expected. It meant whoever came in wasn't trying to hide all evidence, only enough to avoid immediate suspicion. When I went to bed that night, I positioned a suitcase and a metal folding chair against the laundry room door, not as a real barricade, but as a way to alert me if anyone tried to come through. I kept a lamp on, telling myself it was just for comfort, though I knew I didn't fully believe that. Sometime after midnight, I caught a faint sound again, barely their movement, too steady to be pipes or settling wood. The chair trembled slightly, just enough to tap against the wall, and everything inside me paused at once. I didn't call out. I didn't move. I just stared at the shadow beneath the door, watching it shift in a slow, gliding motion, as if someone were studying the outline of my barricade from the other side. The moment that shadow drifted away, I realized there was no chance I'd sleep again. I sat upright in bed for what felt like an hour, listening to the deep quiet settle back into the walls. When I finally worked up the courage to approach the laundry door, the air near it felt unusually cool, like the room on the other side had been opened to a draft. I pushed the suitcase aside and gently pressed the door's edge. The lock held, just as I'd left it. That should have reassured me, but all it did was confirm that someone had found a way to move through the space without disturbing anything I controlled. I backed away slowly, making sure every light in the suite was on before I returned to the bed. At sunrise, I packed my bag in silence. The decision felt instinctive, not panicked, just necessary. Before leaving, I opened the laundry room door cautiously, half expecting someone to be waiting behind it. Instead, I found a detail I hadn't noticed before: a narrow seam in the drywall behind the dryer, running vertically like a hidden panel. The edges were smudged with faint streaks of gray, almost like fingerprints dragging along plaster. I didn't touch it. Just seeing it was enough to understand how easily someone could slip in and out without using the locked door at all. The entire setup suddenly made sense in a way that made the room feel smaller. When I stepped outside, Laura was on the porch watering a planter filled with wilted basil. She didn't look surprised to see me leaving early. She just asked if everything had been comfortable enough, phrasing it in a way that made the question sound like a test rather than genuine concern. I told her I had a schedule change and needed to hit the road. She nodded slowly, as though she already knew I wouldn't be staying. Her expression didn't show guilt or relief, just a strange, unreadable passivity that made me wonder how many other guests had cut their stays short without explanation. I didn't wait for further conversation. I walked to my car, feeling the urge to keep a steady pace until I reached the driver's seat. I reported the listing that afternoon, attaching everything I could describe without sounding unhinged. The platform took the report but never followed up with details, only confirming they were reviewing the matter. A week later, curiosity pushed me to check the listing again, and it had already been removed. No explanation, no replacement, nothing. I still think about that thin vertical seam behind the dryer and the voices whispering in the dark. Whatever was happening in that house felt practiced, routine even, like I'd just stumbled into someone else's nightly pattern. And even though I left without confrontation, the knowledge that people had been walking through the suite while I slept has stayed with me in a way that's hard to fully shake.